There is a cauldron that has emanated this law, and the reason that the law is a bad one are several. The first is that, as our police chief has said, and I think Councilman Clamp rightly pointed out, as I've often said, that the number one priority, the most basic responsibility of any city government, in fact, the first reason that people collectively submit to a government is for their own safety. Public safety is the number one priority. It always has to be in our community. And as our police chief has said, this legislation includes provisions that would siphon off the resources of our local government and cause our police, local police, to have to enforce what is federal law, for which we have federal folks who enforce that law. It would also encourage frivolous lawsuits. These are provisions that differ radically from federal law. You will not find anywhere in federal law, you can look in any federal code book, you will not find provisions like the ones in Arizona's law that our Texas legislators want to pass. Provisions that encourage anybody, no matter what county they live in a state, to sue a police department because they believe that this law, this bill, is not being enforced correctly by the police department, and burden our police department with defending these types of frivolous lawsuits. It also imposes a reasonable suspicion standard for investigating whether someone is here legally or not. In other words, it imposes a weak standard on what is a very complicated set of determinations on whether somebody is here legally or not. How do you tell if somebody is here legally or illegally? By the way they look, by the way they sound, by what they're doing, by where they work. And I think in that point is something that has been under-recognized throughout the debate. Our statement today is not only a statement about what this type of legislation would mean for folks who may be here who are undocumented, it's principally a statement about what it will mean for people who are here who are citizens, who are legal. And what it will mean is that the police department will be hounded and hounded and hounded in a court of law until they press down and scrutinize and try and find every single person that they, quote unquote, think might look like they're illegal, and try and enforce this law against them to avoid more lawsuits. That's just an untenable position to put a police department in. It makes no sense, and I believe that it cannot happen in Texas or in San Antonio. It has been pointed out, I think correctly, many times that the city of San Antonio doesn't often pass resolutions like this. That's true, although it's not unprecedented. And folks have asked, well, why in the world are you doing this? You know, nobody cares in Arizona whether or not San Antonio, the San Antonio City Council, says that it doesn't agree with this approach of this bill. And I grant you that. I don't think that anybody in Phoenix or Flagstaff or Mesa cares whether or not this body of elected officials agrees or disagrees with them. That's not the point. The point is that this is an issue that is going to be debated and deliberated upon and legislated upon in the next legislative session of the Texas legislature. That means that it is our business about whether or not this Arizona type legislation is forwarded and takes hold in Texas or not. We routinely have the opportunity to vote one way or another on endorsements of legislation or objections to legislation that are coming before us. We do that at times before the legislative session, before we know the details of legislation. This is nothing new. We're not breaking any new ground. This is a copy of our state legislative agenda from the last legislative session. I'll grant folks that we are doing this earlier than we normally would, And let me tell you why we're doing it earlier than we normally would. Because this is not your everyday, ordinary bill. There is the possibility that this type of legislation will infect the state of Texas, and the price for San Antonio would be too high to pay to just sit around and wait and not prepare. So if the question is, am I going to send something to another council committee, or am I going to have the council actually listen to the public and then take a vote in June instead of in November, then I'm going to do it in June, because the issue is that important to the unity of San Antonio and to the ability of our police department to fight crime. Texas has always been different in its approach to these matters. Some folks have asked, well, you know, why do you care if somebody's going to stop you if you don't have a permit for your garage sale and you don't have a permit, so they go up to you and then they ask you, while they're checking as to whether or not you have a permit, they also ask you to see whether you're here legally or not. You know, if you're here legally, I mean, if they asked me that, I would produce my driver's license. One of the reasons is that this bill doesn't require that every single person be subjected to that kind of scrutiny. It requires that folks for whom there is quote-unquote reasonable suspicion, in other words, they look illegal, they will be subjected to that scrutiny. To use a rough analogy that I agree is not a perfect one, it is the same reason that we don't have red light cameras at every intersection of our city. We could do that. We could use our resources for that. And if we did that, we would catch a whole bunch more folks who are speeding. But we've chosen not to do that because we don't want to enforce that law in such a way that overly burdens citizens. We could choose to have our police wait outside of every bar 100 feet away at 2 o'clock in the morning and stop everybody who leaves the bar based on a reasonable suspicion that since they've been in a bar all the way up until 2 o'clock in the morning, that they're intoxicated. And I have no doubt that we would find more folks than we do now who are intoxicated. And you know what? If somebody asked me about that, I don't drink. So I might say, well, go ahead, go do it. In fact, put all the checkpoints that you want. Stop 1.3 million San Antonians that you want to stop, because I don't drink and you're never going to catch me intoxicated like that. So I have no problem whatsoever with that type of law. But I think all of us in the room know that that's not quite the way that we want to enforce those laws. It's also necessary, I think, to point out that this is a divisive issue. People have very strong feelings on both sides. But the division does not emanate from the fact that we're taking up this resolution. The division emanates from the fact that Texas legislators have decided to try and introduce this legislation into the state of Texas. It emanates from the fact that you had a poorly written law based on legitimate frustrations. That is where the division on this issue emanates. I would also say that just because people are divided, in other words, they have a different perspective on an issue, does not mean that we should consider that issue radioactive. In fact, it is a sign of a mature democracy that we can take up even issues that sometimes divide us virulently, that we have very strong feelings on either side of the aisle, and that we can take those divisions up and deliberate them as policymakers and as residents, and come out of that process in a healthy way, in a way that betters the community. And we can do that. San Antonio is the nation's 7th largest city. And we want to be a city of the world. If we're going to be that city of the world, we can't be a city that simply says, you know, we're not going to hear any evil, we're not going to speak any evil, we're going to shut ourselves out from the rest of the world. That is not what a mature city does. I grant you that only sparingly should we do a resolution, but this is one of those times, because this issue impresses itself upon Texas, that we must take a stand and pass this resolution.